where you had a crisis emerge, and the system, quote unquote, worked. It prevented revolution. It prevented the benighted working classes from coming together to overthrow it. But it did so in a way that required neither party to be coherent ideologically. Now, it's not to say that there was not friction within these parties that were held together through spit and baling wire. There really was. And the most intense moment of intra-party conflict that happened during this early 20th century era was the 1924 Democratic Convention. Now, as I said, the Democratic Party was an alliance between Southern whites and Northern white ethnics. Southern whites, almost entirely Protestant, Northern ethnics, largely Catholic. Now, there are significant cultural differences between these two groups, and those cultural differences also ended up being reflected in policy differerences. The main one being the issue of prohibition in the 20s. Southern Protestant Democrats were dry. They endorsed prohibition. They wanted to see the evils of John Barleycorn banished from the land. And Northern Catholic ethnics vehemently opposed it, were wet. Drinking was part of their culture, be they Bavarian Catholics, Germans, or Irish, or Italians. They all drank, and they all wanted to keep drinking. And in 1924, that conflict came to a head when the two people at the top of the race for the Democratic presidential nomination were Thomas McAdoo, who had been Woodrow Wilson's Treasury Secretary, and New York Governor Al Smith. McAdoo was a Californian and a Protestant. Al Smith, the first Catholic to seek a major party nomination, a good Irish boy from the Bowery. In 1924, the Democratic National Convention met to pick a nominee in New York City at Madison Square Garden, and McAdoo supporters and Smith supporters from the jump were at daggers drawn over two main issues. One was prohibition. McAdoo staunchly supported it and wanted to maintain it. Smith ardently opposed. And the Ku Klux Klan, which during the 20s was at its zenith of influence, largely concentrated in the Democratic Party, although not entirely. Indiana was largely controlled during this period by a Republican machine that was also the Ku Klux Klan in that state. But one of the main tenets of the Klan was hostility to Catholicism. So the Northern Democrats were incredibly anti-Klan and accused McAdoo of being a secret Klansman. McAdoo denied being a Klansman, but not convincingly enough for many Northern Democrats. And what ended up happening was a complete shit show. They had ballots, they failed. They had ballots, they failed. They voted. They marched, they hollered, they fought. Fistfights on the floor of the convention were incredibly common. It ended up taking 108 ballots for the Democrats to finally land on a compromise candidate, John W. Davis, who went on to be absolutely destroyed by Calvin Coolidge in the fall election. But that just shows that, well, the regional nature of the party system prevented the constitutional system from breaking down and becoming non-functional. It had its own sublimated conflicts that ended up being fought in other arenas because it couldn't be fought at the actual level of government because, as I said, they were made up by these broad coalitions who shared power together when they held power, and as such, couldn't fight over these issues at that point, at that level. So now I want to talk about two distinct crisis points in 20th century American history that were dealt with through two distinct types of party compromise and cooperation, both of which are pined after by people in Washington right now, and both of which are impossible in an era of ideologically polarized parties. The first was the New Deal. FDR came into power on the back of the complete failure of the Republican Party and Herbert Hoover to handle the crisis of the Great Depression. Democrats swarmed the House and the Senate, had massive majorities in both chambers, and ran the country. But of course, this was not a ideologically coherent party, as we said. It was made up of this motley arrangement of northern workers and increasingly northern liberal professionals and southern whites. And that meant that the New Deal could not be dictated by one side. It needed to be negotiated intra-partily. So that's one type of compromise that is being pined after. Intra-party compromise, where within one party, this being the Democrats who held power in all of the chambers, because the party was ideologically diverse, it needed to negotiate within itself how to do the New Deal. That wasn't just in terms of race. I mean, it's often talked about how FDR and the liberals had to sort of sacrifice racial justice on the altar of economic reform. And to a degree, that's true, but it goes beyond that as well, because while Southern Democrats did welcome the sort of broad reforms that FDR was in favor of, it must be remembered that the South was also dominated by local grandees and power brokers who had their own ideology and were hostile to organized labor in a way that party bosses in the North were not. And so that's another axis that had to be negotiated between the two parts of the coalition, the broad coalition of the Democratic Party. But the thing that needs to be remembered is that in a situation like this, where you hold the presidency and you hold the gavels in the chambers, this negotiation is not zero-sum. There can be a give and take, because either way, you're still in power. You hold these offices, you hold these seats. And therefore, within that party, there can be a non-zero-sum negotiation that gives both sides something in exchange for compromise on other things. So that's one sort of compromise that these people hearken to. And this is specifically what Biden was talking about when he was talking about Eastland. He was talking about this sort of intra-party compromise, which is totally superseded by the emergence of ideologically coherent parties. It is largely irrelevant, much more so anyway than it was then. And one of the real ways you can see that Biden has completely failed to realize how the ground has shifted underneath his feet by hearkening back to a model for compromise that isn't even really relevant anymore. The second example I want to talk about is after World War II, the civil rights movement and the crisis caused by the civil rights activism that led inevitably to a cry for reform that was so overwhelming, so powerful, had such a huge grip over such a large percentage of the population who were willing to break the law, who were willing to defy authority in order to see justice done, that something had to give, if only to stop the Russians from making a big deal about it. At least that was JFK's thought. Now, in this situation, the civil rights movement, the intra-party compromise I talked about earlier, is not as important because, well, Southern Democrats during the New Deal were willing to work with the North on a lot of these economic issues. They were absolutely not willing to compromise on civil rights. For them, this was a zero-sum game. The degree to which blacks in the South gained rights was the degree to which they and their constituents lost them. That was how they thought of it. So they were not going to be reconciled. And in the past, that had been the number one stumbling block to any kind of reform. That's why for the first half of the 20th century, the filibuster was almost exclusively used by Southern Democrats to prevent the bringing forth of civil rights legislation. And that was okay in a period when the pressure for civil rights was relatively muted. But once the civil rights struggle became pandemic, became overawing, became the domestic news story, the social crisis of the time, that couldn't happen anymore. And so now, with the civil rights movement becoming the domestic crisis of the moment, the way that Southern intransigence was overwhelmed was through the second type of compromise that is longed for in Washington now, inter-party compromise. And so because the Southern Democrats were not going to move on it, what happened is that Northern liberal Democrats and Lyndon Johnson made a common cause with Northern liberal Republicans, which there were. As I said, there were tons of liberal Republicans at that time because in large parts of the North, you just voted Republican. You just weren't going to vote for a Democrat. It was a lingering effect of slavery. But that didn't mean that you were inherently reactionary. You very well might have liberal views on any number of topics. You were probably less sympathetic to the labor movement than Northern Democrats were, although not as probably more sympathetic to them than many Southern Democrats were. But on an issue like civil rights, you could very well be a liberal and be a Republican. And so the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the foundational pieces of legislation that cracked Southern segregation were passed by an inter-party coalition of Northern liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans, or at the very least moderate Republicans who, even if they were personally not that thrilled about the idea of government interference in the commerce, were even less thrilled about looking like a bunch of quasi-Nazis to the world during the Cold War. Now, the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation of the 60s helped create the new world that we've been living in and that Washington has failed to comprehend, a world in which the conflict that was always implicit between a party political system and the constitutional federal governmental system is coming into focus and becoming salient. And that was ideological sorting, because the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, as we all know, and other things having to do with the crisis of the 60s led a exodus of reactionary Southern whites away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, led the Democratic Party to be associated broadly more with liberalism than with any kind of lingering regional affection, and the Republican Party being broadly associated with conservatism as opposed to any lingering thing having to do with the Civil War. And it took decades for this to play out. It didn't happen right away. It has to be reminded of that. The first real inkling of it happening was 1964, when the Solid South, which was called that because it was solidly Democratic for 100 years after the Civil War, cracked, and a number of Southern states voted for Barry Goldwater in 1964. It was furthered by Nixon and at the presidential level, but it didn't really filter down through to the congressional level until 1994. The Republican Revolution of '94, led by Newt Gingrich, was in reality the last gasp of those Southern Democrats who had held on to their seats. They were finally replaced, almost en masse, by a new crop of ideologically galvanized Republicans. So finally, we have ideologically coherent political parties. Now, obviously, you can go too far in saying they're ideologically coherent. There is significant difference, in my view, between somebody, like Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren and someone like Joe Lipinski or Joe Biden, for that matter.